everybody. Today's chapter is going to be a little bit different because I'm actually going to skip over the chapter that normally would be read today. It was chapter 17. I'm going to sum it up for you. The reason I'm skipping over it is because it was kind of horrific and I didn't want to have to read the whole thing out loud. But I will tell you what happened in that chapter so that as it plays a role moving forward, you'll know what occurred. So in chapter 17, we are taken to the area surrounding Smithfield and told in great detail how horrific the lives of the poor were in this area. In the course of this, we're introduced to a brother and sister who are 7 and 5 years old respectively. Their names are Harry and Fanny. They are sent out every day to beg, and then they bring their money back to their parents. And on this particular day, they didn't get as much money as their parents wanted, and so they are subsequently beaten and treated very, very cruelly and horrifically. Their parents' names are Bill and Polly. It's established that Bill is a murderer and a thief. We don't know exactly what Polly does, but we know she's not a good person. And in the end, they close out the chapter with Polly explaining a plot that she has in which she will blind her daughter, physically blind her, in order to make her a more efficient beggar because people will feel sorry for her. You can imagine why I did not want to read that chapter. So that is the summary. That should be everything that we need to know, but I'm not actually going to read the whole thing out loud. I will move on to chapter 18, and that's where we're going to start today. So here we go. Chapter 18, The Boozing Ken. "Come in," exclaimed Bill. "I dare say it's Dick Flarer." "Well, Bill Bolter, old fellow, here you are at last," cried the newcomer. "I suppose you knowed I should come here this evening. If you hadn't sent me that message the other day by the young area sneak what got his discharge out a cold bath jug, I should have come all the same. I remembered very well that you was sentenced to 6 months on it, and I'd calculated days and weeks right enough. Sit down, Dick, and blow a cloud. What news since I last saw you?" "None. You know that Cranky Jem is nabbed. He and the Resurrection Man did a panny together somewhere up Soho way. They got off safe with the swag, and the Resurrection Man went on to the Mint. Jem took to the old house in Chick Lane and let me in for my regulars. But after a week or 10 days, the Resurrection Man nosed upon him, and Will turned King's evidence afore the beaks. So Jem was handed over to the Dubsman, and this time he'll get lagged for life." You recognize who this is, right? Dick and Bill from the murder house. Cranky Jem, who they were talking about, who just got turned in by the Resurrection Man, which I'm assuming was a Resurrection Man. Those are people who dug up corpses from graveyards to sell to medical schools. "All right, of course he will. He has been twice to the Floating Academy. There ain't no chance this time. But as for business," said Dick Flarer after a pause, during which he lighted his pipe and paid his respects to the beer, "my gropus is as empty as a barrister's bag the day after sessions. I have but one bob left in Maclay, and that will spend in brandy presently. My Molly's is regular itchin' for a job. Summat must be done, and that soon, too," returned Bill Bolter. "By the by, I suppose we try that crib which we meant to crack 4 years or so ago, when you got nabbed the very next morning for faking a blowin's flag from her nutty arm." "What, you mean Markham's, up between Kentish Town and Lower Holloway?" said Dick. "The same. Don't you recollect? We settled it all the very night as we threw that young fella down the trap in Chick Lane. But by goles, Dick, what the deuce is the matter with you?" Dick Flarer had turned deathly pale at the mention of this circumstance. His knees shook, and he cast an uneasy and rapid glance around him. "Come, Dick, don't be a fool," said the woman. "You don't think there is any ghosts here, do you?" "Ghosts?" he exclaimed with a convulsive start. Then, after a moment's silence, during which his two companions surveyed him with curiosity and fear, he added in a low and subdued tone, "Bill, you know there wasn't a man in all the neighborhood bolder than me up to the time when you got into trouble. You know that I didn't care for ghosts or churchyards or dark rooms or anything of that kind. Now it's quite altered. If even a man seed spirit of a person, that man was me about 2 months ago." "What the devil does this mean?" cried Bolter, looking uneasily around him in his turn. "2 months ago," continued Dick Flarer, "I was up Hackney way, expecting to do a little business with Tom the Cracksman, which didn't come off, for Tom had been at the boozing ken all the night before, and had blowed his hand up in a lark with some Davy's dust. Well, I was coming home again, infernal sulky at the affairs breaking down, when just as I got to Cambridge Heathgate, I heard the galloping of horses. I looks around, naturally enough, but who should I see upon a lovely chestnut mare?" "Who?" said Bill anxiously. "The spirit of that very same young feller as you and I threw down the trap at the old house in Chick Lane 4 years and some months ago." "We know who that is." "Mightn't it have been a mistake, Dick?" demanded Bill. "Why, of course it was," exclaimed the woman. "No, it weren't," said Dick very seriously. I'd never tell you a lie to my pal Bill. That you knows well enough. I seed that young man as plain as I can see you now, Bill. As plain as I see you, Polly Bolter. I thought I should have dropped. I fell right against a post in the footpath, but I took another good long look. There he was, the same face, the same hair, the same dress, everything the same. I couldn't be mistaken, I'd swear to it. And would you tell this story to the parish prigs, so be as you was a-going to tuck up fair tomorrow morning? Demanded Bill. I would, cried Dick solemnly, striking his hand upon the table at the same time. There was a long pause. Even the woman, who was perhaps more hardened in vice and more inaccessible to anything in the shape of sentiment than her male companions, seemed impressed by the positive manner in which the man told his story. Well, come, this won't do, said Dick after the lapse of some minutes. Ghost or no ghost, we can't afford to be honest. No, we must be up to something, returned Bill. If we went and offered ourselves to the parish prig, he wouldn't take us as his clerk and sexton, so if he won't give us a lift, who the devil will? But about that Markham place... The old fellow died a few months ago, I heard, said Dick. The eldest son run away. That brought about the father's death. As for the young'un, he was grabbed this afternoon for smashing queer screens. The devil he was! Well, there ain't no good to be done in that quarter, then. Do you know any other speculation? Tom the Cracksman and me was going to do a panny in a neat little crib up by Clapton. That time when he blowed his hand nearly off, larking with his Ben coals. I don't see why it shouldn't be done now. Tom told me about it. A young swell, fond of horses and dogs, lives exceedingly quiet, never no company scarcely, but plenty of tin. Servants, said Bill interrogatively. One man, an old groom, and 2 women, 3 in all, replied Dick. That'll do, observed the woman approvingly. Must we speak to the Cracksman first? Demanded Bill. Yes, fair play's a jewel. I don't believe the Resurrection Man would ever have chirped if he had been treated properly. But if this thing is to be done, let it be done tomorrow night. And now let us go to the boozing ken and speak to the Cracksman. I'm your man, said Bill, and the 2 thieves left the room together. A young man fond of horses who lives with only 1 manservant and 2 women. That sounds like Walter Sidney. Ah! Okay, oh my goodness. At the top of Union Court is Bleeding Heart Yard, leading to Kirby Street, at right angles to which is a narrow alley terminating on Great Saffron Hill. This was the road the burglars took. It was now 11 o'clock, and a thick fog so dense that it seemed as if it could be cut with a knife prevailed. The men kept close together, for they could not see a yard before them. Here and there lights glimmered in the miserable casements, and the fog, thus faintly illuminated at intervals, appeared of a dingy copper color. The burglars proceeded along Saffron Hill. The streets were nearly empty, but now and then the pale, squalid, and nameless forms of vice were heard at the doorways of a few houses, endeavoring to lure the passers-by into their noisome abodes. The great portion of the unwholesome life of that district had sought relief from the pangs of misery and the remorse of crime in sleep. Alas, the slumbers of the poor and of the guilty are haunted by the lean, lank, and gaunt visages of penury, and all the fearful escort of turpitude. Through the broken shutters of several windows came the sounds of horrible revelry, ribald and revolting, and from others issued cries, shrieks, and oaths, and the sounds of heavy blows, a sad evidence of brutality and drunken quarrels. Even at the late hour at which the 2 burglars were wending their way over Saffron Hill, boys of ages ranging from 7 to 15 were lurking in the courts and alleys, watching for any decently dressed persons who might happen to pass that way. Those boys had, for the most part, been seduced from the control of their parents by the receivers of stolen goods in Field Lane, or else had been sent into the streets to thieve by those vile parents themselves. Thus, as the hulks, the convict ships, the penitentiaries, and the gallows relieve society of one generation of villains and others springing up to occupy the vacancy. And this will always be the case so long as laws tend only to punish and aim not to reform. Dick Flarer and Bill Bolter proceeded without exchanging many words together through the dense fog until they reached a low public house which they entered. Nothing could be more filthy nor revolting than the interior of this boozing ken. Sleeps, costermongers, women of the town were crowded around the bar, drinking various malt and spirituous liquors fearfully adulterated. The beer, having been originally deluged with water to increase the quantity, had been strengthened by drugs of most deleterious qualities, such as tobacco juice and cocculus indicus. The former is a poison as subtle as that of a viper. The latter is a berry of such venomous properties that if thrown into a pond, it will speedily send the fish up to the surface to gasp and die. The gin was mixed with vitriol, as hinted above, and the whiskey, called Paddy's Eye Water, with spirits of turpentine. Oh. The pots and glasses in which the various beverages were served up were all stood upon double trays, with a cavity between and numerous holes in the upper surface. The overflowings and drainings were thus caught and saved, and the landlord dispensed the precious compound which bore the name of all sorts at a halfpenny a glass. Oh. So the little bits left on all the cups after people drank were all poured into like a container and then sold as another drink. Oh, this is gross. The two burglars nodded familiarly to the landlord and his wife as they passed the bar and entered a little low smoky room denominated the parlor. A tremendous fire burnt in the grate, at which a short, thin, dark man with a most forbidding countenance was sitting, agreeably occupied in toasting a sausage. The right hand of this man had lost the two middle fingers. This must be Tom, the one who blew part of his hand off. The stumps of which were still covered with plaster, as if the injury had been recent. He was dressed in a complete suit of corduroy. The sleeves of his jacket, the lower part of his waistcoat, and the front of his trousers were covered with grease. On the table near him stood a huge piece of bread and a pot of beer. This individual was Tom the Cracksman, the most adroit and noted burglar in the metropolis. He kept a complete list of all the gentlemen's houses in the environs of London, with the numbers of servants and male inhabitants in each. He never attempted any dwelling within a circuit of 3 miles of the General Post Office. His avocation was invariably exercised in the suburbs of London, where the interference of the police was less probable. At the moment when we introduced him to our readers, he was somewhat down on his luck, as he himself expressed it, the accident which had happened to his hand through playing with gunpowder having completely disabled him for the preceding 2 months, and the landlord of the boozing-ken having made it an invariable rule never to give credit. Thus, though the Cracksman had spent hundreds of pounds in that house, he could not obtain so much as a glass of all sorts without money. The Cracksman was alone in the parlor when Dick Flarer and Bill Bolter entered. Having toasted his sausage, the renowned burglar placed it upon bread and began eating his supper by means of formidable clasp knife, without deigning to cast a glance around. At length Bill Bolter burst out into a loud laugh and claimed, "Why, Tom, you're getting proud all on a sudden. You won't speak to your friends?" "Hello, Bill, is that you?" said the burglar. "When did they turn you out of the jug?" "This morning at 12, and with never a brown in my pocket. Luckily the old woman had turned the children to some use during the time I was at the stepper, or else I don't know what would have become of us. And I'm as completely stitched up as a man could be if he'd just come out of the workhouse," said Tom. "I just now spent my last tanner for this here grub. It's a hard thing for a man like me to be brought down to Cagmag," he added, glancing sulkily at the sausage, which he was eating half raw. "We all sees ups and downs," observed Dick Flarer. "My opinion is that we are too free when we have the blunt." "And there's them as is too close when we haven't it," returned the Cracksman bitterly. "There's the landlord of this crib, won't give a gentleman like me tick, not for one blessed farthing. But things can't go on so. I'm blowed if I won't do a crack that shall be worth while, and then I'll open a ken in opposition to this. You'd see whether I'd refuse a pal tick in the hour of need. So if I could make money, I'd open up a house and be this dude's competition. Take him down." "Well, you don't suppose that we are here just to amuse ourselves," said Dick. "We come to see you." "Is anything to be done?" demanded the Cracksman. "First answer me this," cried Dick. "Has that crib at Upper Clapton been cracked yet?" "What, where there's a young swell? I don't know nothing more about it than what you told me," interrupted Dick. "Me and you was to have it done it, and then you went larking with the Davies dust." "I know the crib you mean," said the Cracksman hastily. "That job is yet to be done. Are you the chaps to have a hand in it?" "That's the very business that we're come for," answered Bill. "Well," resumed the Cracksman, "it seems we're all stumped up and can't hold out no longer. We won't put this thing off. It shall be done tomorrow night. 11's the hour. I'll go Dalston way. You two can arrange about the roads you'll take, so long as you don't go together, and we all three meet at the gate of Ben's Price Field at 11 o'clock. "So far so good," said Dick Flarer. "I've got a darky, but we want the kiffers and tools, and a sack," added Bill. "We must get all these things of old Moses Hart, the fence, and give him a share of the swag," exclaimed the Cracksman. "Don't bother yourselves about that. I'll make it all right." "Well, now that's settled," said Dick. "I've got a bob in my pocket, and we'll have a rinse of the bingo." The burglar went out to the bar and returned with some brandy, which he and his companions drank pure. "So Cranky Jem's in quad," observed the Cracksman after a pause. "Yes, and the Resurrection Man, too, but he is chirped and will be let out after sessions." In other words, he ratted him out. "You have heard of this freak over in Barrow, I suppose," said Cracksman. "No, I haven't," answered Bill. "What was it?" "Oh, a capital joke. The story's rather long, but it will bear telling. There's a young fellow of the name of Sam Chisney, and his father died about 2 years ago, leaving £2,000 in the funds. The widow was to enjoy the interest during her life, and then it was to come principal and interest both to Sam. Well, the old woman gets into debt and is arrested. She goes over to the bench, takes the rules, and hires a nice lodging on the ground floor in Belvedere Place. The young fellow wants his money very bad and doesn't seem at all disposed to wait for the old lady's death, particular as she might live another 10 years. Well, he comes across the Resurrection Man and tells him just how he's situated. The Resurrection Man thinks over the matter and, after a bit of a scholar, understands the business. Off they goes and consults a lawyer named Much Chisel. We met Much Chisel! Okay, this is all getting all mixed together. Who lives up in the New Road somewhere near the Servants' Arms there. I know that crib well, observed Bill. It's a real tidy and respectable one. So Much Chisel, Sam Chisney, and the Resurrection Man lay their heads together and settle the whole business. The young chap then goes over to the old woman and tells her what is to be done. She consents and all's right. Well, that very day, the old lady is taken so bad, so very bad, she thinks she's gonna die. She won't have no doctor, but she sends for a nurse, as she knows, an old creature upwards of 70 and nearly in her dotage. Then Sam comes, and he's so sorry to see his poor dear mother so ill, and she begins to talk very pious and to bless him and tell him as how she feels that she can't live 24 hours. Sam cries dreadful and swears he won't leave his poor dear mother, no, not for all the world. He sits up with her all night and is so exceeding kind, and he goes out and gets a bottle of medicine, which arter all won't no think, but sometimes it's so hard to read their way of speaking, which weren't nothing but gin and peppermint. The old nurse is quite pleased to think that the old woman has got such an attentive son, and he sends out to get a little rum, and the old nurse goes to bed blind drunk. What the devil was all that for? Demanded Dick. You'll see in a moment, resumed the Cracksman. Next night at about 10 o'clock, the young fellow says to the nurse, Nurse, my poor dear mother is wasting away. She can't last out the night. I do feel so miserable. I fancy a drop of the rum that they sell at a particular public close up by Westminster Bridge. Well, my dear, says the nurse, I'll go and get a bottle there, for I feel that we shall both want somewhat to cheer us up through this blessed night. So the old nurse toddles off to get the rum at the place Sam told her. He had sent her away to a good long distance on purpose. The moment she was gone, Mrs. Chisney gets up, dresses herself as quick as she can, and is all ready just as a hackney coach drives up to the door. Sam runs down. All was right as the mail. There was the Resurrection Man in the coach with the dead body of an old woman that had only been buried the day before and that he'd had up again during the night. So Sam and the Resurrection Man, they gets the stiff and upstairs, and Mrs. Chisney, she jumps into the coach and drives away to a comfortable lodging which Much Chisel had got for her up in Somerstown. Now I begin to twig, exclaimed Dick Farrer. Presently the old nurse comes back, and Sam meets her on the stairs, whimpering as hard as he could, and says, Oh, nurse, your poor dear missus is gone. Your poor dear missus is gone. So she was. No mistake about that. Well, the nurse begins to cry, but Sam gets her upstairs and plies her so heartily with the rum that she got blind drunk once more, without ever thinking of laying the body out, so she didn't find out it was quite cold. Next day she washed it and laid it out properly, and as she was nearly blind, she didn't notice that the features wasn't altogether the same. The body, too, was a remarkable freshen, and so everything went on as well as could be wished. Sam then stepped over to the marshal of the bench and gave him notice of his mother's death, and as she died in the rules, there must be an inquest. So a jury of prisoners was called, and the old nurse was examined and said how exceeding attentive the young man had been and all that, and then Sam himself was called. Of course he told a good tale, and then the coroner says, Well, gentlemen, I suppose you'll like to look at the body. So over they all goes to Belvedere Place, and the foreman of the jury just pokes his nose in at the door of the room where the corpse was lying, and no one else even went more than half up the staircase. After this, the jury is quite satisfied and return a verdict of died from natural causes, accelerated by confinement in the rules of the King's Bench prison. And to this, as they were prisoners themselves, they added some very severe remarks upon the deceased's unfeeling and remorseless creditors. Then comes the funeral, which was very respectable, and Sam Chisney was chief mourner, and he cried a good deal. All the people who saw it said they never saw a young man so dreadful cut up. In this way they killed the old woman, the son proved her death, got the money, and sold it out every farthing, and he and his mother is keeping a public house together somewhere up Spitalfields way. The Resurrection Man and Much Chisel each got 100 for their share in the business, and the thing passed off as comfortable as possible. Well, I'm blowed if that isn't the best lark I ever heard, said Dick, when the Cracksman had brought his tale to an end. So it is, added Bill. What a great story about crime and fraud. The parlor of the Boozing Ken now received some additional guests, all belonging to the profession of roguery, though not all following precisely the same line. Thus there were cracksmen, magsmen, area sneaks, public patterers, buzzglokes. Ooh, I don't know what a buzzgloke is. I need to look that up. dummy hunters, compter prigs, smashers, flimsy kitties, macers, coiners, begging letter imposters, and so on. That motley crew soon became uproarious and revolting. Those who had money lavished it with the most reckless profusion, and thus those who had none were far from being in want of liquor. The Cracksman was evidently a great man amongst this horrible fraternity. His stories and songs invariably commanded attention. It is not our purpose to detain the reader much longer in the parlor of the boozing ken. We have doubtless narrated enough in this and the preceding chapter to give him a faint idea of some of the horrors of London. Yes, I think we've learned more than we need to know. He cannot, however, allow the morning scene to pass unnoticed. Something's happening the next morning. Okay, so we know that the bad guys from the murder house are now aware that Walter is not dead. We know that they are going to go break into a house that I really honestly think is Walter's, and I'm worried about how that's going to go. Richard has been taken up on accusations of forgery. Okay, we'll see you tomorrow for the next chapter.